The city was alive with the hum of money. In this place, glass towers stretched toward the sky as if competing with one another, where luxury cars slid through wide streets, and where old money and new power often collided in silent, invisible battles. It was the kind of city where reputations mattered more than truth, and where the smile you wore in public could hide the knives you held in private. The night it all began was warm, the kind of evening that should have promised comfort, but the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the sense that something was about to crack. In a private hall at one of the most exclusive country clubs, the room glittered with chandeliers and hushed conversations. The walls carried the weight of old portraits of families who had built their fortunes generations ago. They watched silently from their frames as the present generation carried on the legacy of privilege. The guests moved around the room with practiced ease, balancing glasses of champagne and laughing softly, though every laugh carried a calculation behind it. No one in that room existed without purpose. Every word, every glance, was part of a larger game. Among them was a woman who did not quite belong, though she had been invited with warmth, or at least the appearance of it. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her hands clasped tightly together, as if holding on to her own dignity in a room designed to make her feel small. She was a mother, one who had raised her son with little more than strength and faith, and tonight she stood quietly at the edge of a world that had never accepted her. Her son was not there yet. He was still on his way, caught in the maze of traffic that wrapped around the city. She had agreed to attend the gathering early, trusting that kindness would meet her. Instead, she was met with stares that lingered just long enough to remind her of what she was not. At the center of the room, the hosts, an old and immensely wealthy family, moved like royalty. Their name carried weight not only in the city, but across the country, tied to industries that had been passed down for generations. Their fortune was measured in billions, their reach extending into politics, media, and business. They were used to being adored, feared, or both, and they treated every interaction as a performance. To them, power was not just about wealth, but also about the ability to remind others of their place. The deal that had brought everyone together was whispered about like a crown jewel. It was worth nearly $1 billion, a merger that would shake industries and make headlines. On paper, it was simply business, but behind it was a clash of worlds. A self-made black CEO whose rise had been meteoric, who had clawed his way into boardrooms that were never built for him, now standing across from a family whose wealth had never known struggle. To the outside, it looked like the perfect partnership. To those who understood the undertones, it was oil meeting water, history pressing against the present. That night was supposed to be a celebration, an evening meant to smooth over details and bring two powerful names closer together. The mother had been invited, perhaps as a gesture, perhaps as a test. She had never wanted to be here. Her world was far from the chandeliers and champagne. She had lived through years of long hours, quiet sacrifices, and nights of prayer while her son built his empire. Now she stood alone in a room where every whisper felt sharp, every smile a little too forced. There was tension underneath the polished air, though most would not notice it unless they looked closely. The billionaire hosts smiled too widely, laughed too loudly. Their words, when directed at her, carried the kind of sweetness that tasted of poison. She sensed it, though she held her head high. Her presence was tolerated but not welcomed. In their eyes, she was not one of them, no matter how successful her son had become. In another part of the city, her son was in his car, the city lights blurring past him. He was calm, though his mind never stopped moving. He knew tonight mattered. This deal was more than numbers on a contract. It was history being rewritten. He had grown up watching his mother fight against a world that often shut her out, and now he had the power to open doors others had kept locked. He had built his company from the ground up, survived setbacks, betrayals, and challenges that would have broken most men. To him, tonight was supposed to be the start of a new chapter, one where his mother could finally be recognized not just as the woman who raised him, but as someone worthy of respect in her own right. What he didn't know was that respect was the last thing she was being shown. Subtle comments, delivered with smiles, cut into her like blades. A remark about her dress, a question about whether she understood the business being discussed, a laugh at her ex-payee. Hence that rippled through the room. None of it was loud enough to cause a scene, but all of it was loud enough to sting. She tried to ignore it, tried to remind herself that soon her son would arrive and everything would change. The family, for all their wealth and charm, carried something darker in their laughter. They had lived their entire lives at the top, and to them, humiliation was another form of control. It was not enough to be rich. It was not enough to win. They needed others to feel small in their presence, to understand that no matter how far they had climbed, they would never truly be equals. The night had not yet reached its breaking point, but the cracks were already showing. The mother, standing by herself, clutching her glass a little too tightly, could feel the weight of eyes on her. The room was not dangerous in the way dark alleys or abandoned streets were. It was dangerous in a quieter, sharper way. Here, words could wound deeper than knives. And though no one knew it yet, what was being set into motion that evening would end with the collapse of everything they thought they had secured. The moment he walked into the room, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations dipped for just a breath before resuming. His presence demanded attention without him asking for it. Dressed in a dark suit that seemed to fit him like armor, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived enough battles to know his worth. The black CEO had been in rooms like this before, rooms where eyes lingered a moment too long, where whispers followed him like shadows. He had learned to read them, to take in the air, to know when smiles hid daggers. Tonight, the weight of all of it pressed heavier than usual. He spotted his mother across the room, and the first flicker of unease crossed his face. She was standing too still, her posture rigid, her smile thin and forced. He knew her too well not to notice. Her eyes met his for a second, and though she tried to mask it, he caught the glimmer of something. Hurt, perhaps humiliation. His jaw tightened. He walked to her side with measured steps, offering her the shield of his presence. The hosts smiled broadly as he approached, but he noticed the slight change in their expressions. It was the same look he had seen before, the moment someone realizes they are forced to treat him as an equal, but cannot quite hide their discomfort in doing so. The opening pleasantries were cordial, almost too polished. Words about the deal, about the exciting partnership ahead, all dressed in charm. But beneath the surface, the undercurrents were restless. The billionaire patriarch, tall with a silver mane of hair and a reputation for ruthless business tactics, clasped the CEO's hand with just a little too much force. His eyes didn't shine with warmth, they gleamed with calculation. "It's about time we made history together," he said, his tone friendly, but laced with a kind of ownership, as if the CEO's success were a gift he was about to bestow rather than something earned through blood and grit. Through the evening, small exchanges added fuel to a fire that had not yet erupted but burned steadily. The matriarch of the family, elegantly dressed, leaned close to the mother and spoke in a voice dripping with condescension. "You must be so proud," she said. "It must feel strange, I imagine, seeing your son rise so high, so fast. Success can be overwhelming for families not used to it." Her smile never faltered, but her words landed like stones. The mother swallowed her response, her dignity intact, but the wound deepened. The son caught these moments, one by one, though no one thought he noticed. He noticed everything. The laughter that followed his mother's attempts to join a conversation, the dismissive tone when one of the hosts spoke about philanthropy, implying she could not possibly understand the scale of wealth required to change the world. Even the way a server, trained to watch the hosts closely, seemed to follow their lead in treating her with the subtle kind of distance reserved for outsiders. Each moment by itself could be dismissed, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Behind the veil of champagne and soft piano music, the pressure of business loomed. The deal was not just about money. It was about power, control, and legacy. For the billionaire family, merging with the CEO's company was a way to tighten their grip on industries shifting too fast for them to hold alone. For the CEO, it was a chance to push his vision forward, to break barriers that had been locked for generations. But neither side fully trusted the other. For the family, there was jealousy hidden beneath their charm. How could someone without their lineage, their history, rise so quickly, so powerfully, without bowing to them? And for the CEO, there was a quiet anger, sharpened over years of being underestimated, of watching doors slam shut before he forced them open. Tensions grew sharper during a private conversation. In a smaller lounge, away from the grand hall, the CEO and the patriarch sat down to finalize the final pieces of the deal. At first, it was business as usual, numbers, terms, projections. But then the tone shifted. "You're ambitious," the patriarch said, leaning back in his chair. "That's good. But let me be clear. This family doesn't just share power. We own it. We decide where it goes." His smile was thin, his voice calm, but the meaning was clear. The CEO kept his composure, his face unreadable. But inside, a storm raged. He knew what this was. Not partnership, but dominance. In the ballroom, the mother tried to escape into quieter corners, but the matriarch found her again. Another remark, this time sharper. "It must be comforting to know your son will take care of you now. Men like him work so hard. I just hope he doesn't forget where he comes from. Sometimes, success makes people forget their place." The word slipped out with sugar-coated cruelty. It wasn't just an insult. It was a reminder. In her mind, there was a hierarchy, and no matter how far the CEO rose, his mother, his roots, his very identity, would always be beneath theirs. By the time the CEO returned to the hall, his mother's silence told him everything he needed to know. She didn't need to explain. He saw the way the room moved around her, treating her as less. His chest tightened, his hand curled into a fist at his side before he forced it open again. The evening dragged on, and the true faces of the hosts revealed themselves in fragments. A casual joke one of the younger family members made, mocking the way his mother spoke. A careless remark about buying respect that cut through the air like a blade. Each one chipped away at patience, each one sowed a seed of rage. The CEO smiled through it, spoke with precision, kept his voice steady. But inside, he was already beginning to weigh the cost of what it would mean to walk away. External pressures only deepened the cracks. Reporters circled outside the gates, eager for news of the billion-dollar deal. Investors were already celebrating the merger. Shareholders expected results. Backing out would be costly, not just in money, but in reputation. To cancel would be seen as reckless, even self-destructive. But to sign, to join hands with a family that had humiliated his mother in public, would mean swallowing a poison he could never wash out. Other secrets were lingering too. Whispers of the patriarch's ruthless history. Bouzine. Partners crushed, rivals destroyed. Rumors of the family's quiet influence in politics, scandals buried beneath checks that never bounced. These things were never spoken in the open, but the CEO had done his homework. He knew who they really were. He also knew that once he tied his name to theirs, there would be no undoing it. As the night pressed on, the music played, the glasses clinked, and the false smiles continued, but the walls were closing in. The CEO's mother finally asked quietly if they could leave. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of someone who had endured enough. He nodded, but his mind was already made up. This wasn't just about a deal anymore. This was about dignity, respect, and a line that had been crossed too far. The tension had reached a point where every second in that room felt like a test. Every breath, every word, every false smile deepened the fracture between two worlds colliding. The guests saw only glamour, the promise of history being made. But under the glow of chandeliers, the seeds of collapse had already been sown, and when the breaking point came, it would not be quiet. It would be the kind of rupture that could not be undone, no matter how much money was at stake. The night had stretched on too long. The deal was supposed to end with a toast, a round of applause, and the flash of cameras outside the gates. Instead, the tension had grown unbearable, every minute pulling tighter at the strings until they were ready to snap. The ballroom still gleamed with its golden chandeliers and polished marble floors, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. Conversations no longer flowed as easily. There was a sharpness in the air, as if everyone felt, without quite knowing, that the evening was heading towards something irreversible. The CEO stood with his mother near the edge of the room. He had kept his composure, though it was costing him everything. His mother had gone quiet, her face pale, her hand resting lightly against his arm, as if holding him back from doing what he was already thinking of. Across from them, the family laughed too loudly at their own jokes, voices rising above the music as though to remind everyone who controlled the room. Then came the moment that broke it all. One of the younger family members, barely in his 30s, spoiled by wealth and never once checked for his behavior, stumbled toward the mother with a smirk. His drink sloshed in his glass as he leaned in closer than he should have, his words thick with arrogance. "You must be proud," he said, echoing the matriarch's earlier cruelty. "But let's be honest. Without your son's money, you wouldn't even be in this room. People like you should be grateful we let you in." The words hung there, slicing through the polished air like a blade. The laughter that followed, soft, mocking, almost gleeful, was worse than the words themselves. The mother's face flushed, her lips pressed tightly together. She didn't reply. She didn't have to. Her son heard it all, and for the first time that evening he stopped pretending. Something inside him broke. Years of restraints, of biting his tongue, of forcing himself to smile through insults and slights, all collapsed in that moment. The anger he had buried for so long surged up with a force he could no longer contain. He stepped forward, his voice low, sharp, trembling with fury. "Say that again!" he demanded, his eyes locked on the young man. The room went still. Glasses paused midway to lips. Conversations froze. The billionaire patriarch started to intervene, but it was already too late. The young heir, emboldened by the presence of his family, smirked again. "I said, people like her don't belong here." The next seconds blurred into chaos. The CEO's fist connected with the man's jaw before anyone could react, the sound cracking through the silence. The heir stumbled back, crashing into a table, shattering glasses as champagne spilled across the marble. Gasps filled the room, and the music cut off in an awkward, screeching halt. But the CEO didn't stop. Rage coursed through him, blinding and consuming. Years of watching his mother humiliated, of being treated as less despite everything he had built, funneled into his fists. He struck again, harder this time, the young man's lips splitting, blood streaking across his face. Someone screamed. Chairs scraped against the floor as guests backed away. The patriarch rushed forward, grabbing at the CEO's arm, shouting his name. "Enough! Stop this madness!" But his words only fed the fury. The CEO turned on him, his voice thunderous. "You humiliated her. You all think you can buy respect, that you can humiliate people and walk away laughing. Not tonight." In the corner, his mother cried out, begging him to stop, her hands trembling as she reached for him. But he was too far gone. He shoved the patriarch back with a force that sent him staggering, his polished shoes slipping on the wet floor. For a moment, the old man looked small, fragile even, his age showing in the way his body crumpled. The CEO loomed over him, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. The young heir, bloodied but still defiant, spat at the CEO's shoes. That was the final spark. With a roar, the CEO lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar, dragging him up from the floor. The two struggled, a mess of movement, grunts, and broken glass. In the frenzy, no one knew who reached first. But suddenly, a heavy crystal decanter, once filled with fine whiskey, was in the CEO's hand. It swung through the air with terrifying force, colliding with the young man's skull. The sound was sickening, a dull crack that silenced the room. The heir collapsed instantly, his body limp, blood pooling beneath his head, staining the pristine marble floor. For a second, no one moved. The chandelier lights gleamed above as though mocking the horror below. The CEO stood frozen, the decanter still in his hand, his breath ragged, his eyes wide with shock at what he had done. His mother's scream shattered the silence, raw and piercing. Guests scrambled back, some rushing toward the body, others rushing for the doors. The matriarch collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking violently, her voice breaking as she called her son's name. The patriarch, pale and trembling, stared at T, his CEO with a mix of fury and disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed. The CEO dropped the decanter, the glass clattering against the floor, shards scattering. His hands shook, his chest rose and fell like he couldn't breathe. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. He hadn't meant to kill. The anger had taken over, blinding him, pulling him into a darkness he had fought his whole life to escape. Now it was too late. In the immediate chaos, voices overlapped, someone calling for an ambulance, another shouting to lock the doors. The guests were torn between horror and fear, some already rehearsing how they would distance themselves from this scandal. The CEO's mother reached for him, tears streaming down her face, whispering his name over and over as though it could pull him back from the edge. He stood there, unmoving, staring at the body on the floor. Blood spread in a slow, dark pool, seeping into the cracks of the marble. The music had stopped, but in his head there was a deafening roar, like 1,000 voices screaming at once. His empire, his future, everything he had built, all of it crumbled in that instant. The family began to regroup, their grief turning quickly into calculation. The patriarch's voice was low but deadly, his words cutting through the panic. "This isn't just violence. This is war. You've destroyed everything." He wasn't just speaking about his son. He was speaking about the billion-dollar deal, the legacy, the power that had been challenged in front of witnesses. The CEO finally spoke, his voice hollow, trembling. "No," he said, almost to himself. "You destroyed it the moment you disrespected her." The sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, cutting through the night like a warning. Guests whispered frantic excuses, some already slipping away into the dark, terrified of being linked to what had just happened. The room that had once been filled with champagne and laughter was now soaked in blood and silence. The CEO's mother clutched his arm, begging him to leave, but he didn't move. He couldn't. His eyes stayed fixed on the body, as if frozen in time. He had wanted dignity, respect, a future where his mother would never be humiliated again. Instead, he had given the world a tragedy it would never forget. The room emptied quickly after the sirens drew near. Guests who had once clinked glasses and laughed at cruel jokes now slipped into the night with their coats pulled tight, their faces pale. They didn't want their names tied to what had happened. The country club's marble floors still shone under the chandeliers, but now they were smeared with blood. The once pristine space transformed into a scene of horror. The young heir's body had been covered, his head cradled by a frantic staff member who sobbed quietly as paramedics rushed in. The CEO stood still, as if rooted in place, his mother clinging to his arm with trembling hands. He had not spoken since his last words. His chest rose and fell, but his eyes were vacant, like a man who had been pulled from his own body. When police arrived, weapons at the ready, their voices barked commands into the chaos. He didn't resist. He lifted his hands slowly, the blood from the shattered decanter still drying on his skin. His mother begged, cried, pleaded with them not to take him, her voice breaking against the polished walls. But it was useless. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, heavy and cold, and for the first time that night, his composure crumbled. His head lowered, not in shame, but in exhaustion, as though the years of holding everything together had finally collapsed at once. The billionaire family wept loudly, their grief echoing through the hall. The matriarch screamed for her son, her voice raw, while the patriarch turned his fury on the CEO. He shouted promises of ruin, of destruction, vowing to use every cent of his fortune to make sure the man who had killed his heir paid for it in ways far beyond prison. His words weren't just anger, they were truth. He had the influence, the connections, the reach. The crime wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was an attack on legacy. And for a family like his, legacy was everything. The CEO's mother collapsed into a chair once he was led away. She buried her face in her hands, whispering prayers through her sobs. She had raised him to fight, to stand tall against injustice, but she had never wanted this. She replayed the night in her head, the cutting remarks, the humiliation, the way her son's eyes had changed when he heard them. She knew his rage had been building for years. She knew that this night had not created it, but had unleashed it. And now, the very man she had sacrificed everything for was gone, led out of the hall like a criminal. The news spread faster than the blood had pooled. By the next morning, headlines filled every screen. Billion-dollar deal shattered in violence. CEO arrested after brutal attack at country club. The photographs were everywhere. Him in handcuffs, his mother's tear-streaked face, the covered body being carried out on a stretcher. For some, it was a story of arrogance, of a man who could not control his temper. For others, it was a tragedy written by years of systemic disrespect, a man pushed past the point of endurance. The world debated not just the act, but what it meant. His company's stock plummeted. Investors pulled out, terrified of being associated with scandal. Reporters camped outside his headquarters, his home, and his mother's doorstep. His employees, once proud to work for him, faced questions about his character. In boardrooms, whispers turned into decisions to distance themselves. He was no longer the celebrated self-made billionaire. He was now the man who had killed at a country club. The billionaire family played their part well. Public statements of grief poured out, words about a life cut short, about the tragedy of violence. Behind closed doors, they strategized. Their lawyers moved fast, pressing for the harshest charges, ensuring the narrative stayed in their favor. They painted him as dangerous, unstable, unworthy of the success he had achieved. The young heir, once known more for his excesses than his brilliance, was suddenly remembered as a generous son, a promising leader, a victim of senseless rage. For the CEO, prison was cold and merciless. The walls pressed in on him as reporters shouted his name from the gates outside. Nights stretched long, haunted by the sound of his mother's scream. The look on the heir's face before the decanter fell, the feeling of his own hand refusing to let go. He told himself over and over that he hadn't meant for it to happen, that the anger had taken him too far. But in the silence of his cell, guilt carved into him. He saw his mother sitting alone in her small home, facing the world's judgment for raising a son who had become a killer. That guilt was worse than the iron bars. His mother suffered more quietly. Neighbors avoided her, though some whispered sympathy behind closed doors. At church, people offered prayers, but also glances that carried pity. She felt the weight of blame, not just from others, but from herself. She questioned if she had raised him too fiercely, if she had filled him with too much fire to survive a world that despised him. At night, she sat in silence, staring at the phone, waiting for his calls, her heart breaking every time she heard his voice crack on the other end. Public opinion split down the middle. Some argued the crime was proof that success could not erase anger, that money could not civilize rage. Others said it was inevitable, that no man, no matter how strong, could endure a lifetime of disrespect without finally exploding. Protesters gathered outside courthouses, some demanding justice for the dead heir, others holding signs that read, "Respect dignity, not just wealth." The crime had become more than a tragedy. It had become a symbol, a mirror held up to society's deepest fractures. The CEO's reputation was destroyed, but his humanity became the subject of debate. Was he a monster who had thrown away everything, or a man crushed under the weight of humiliation until he broke? The truth was simpler and more painful. He was both. He was a man who loved his mother fiercely, who had fought to build a future for her, and he was a man who had taken a life in a moment of uncontrollable rage. The billionaire family closed ranks. They mourned in public, but their grief was sharpened into vengeance. The patriarch, his once proud figure now stooped with age and loss, vowed not only to bury the CEO in court, but to erase his legacy. He worked the phones late into the night, ensuring allies in politics, business and media stayed on their side. To him, justice wasn't enough. He wanted annihilation. In the weeks that followed, the crime cast a shadow far beyond the country club. Deals stalled, partnerships dissolved. The story dominated every conversation in boardrooms, classrooms, and kitchens. It was no longer just about one death. It was about power, race, wealth, and respect. It forced people to confront questions they had long avoided. Who gets to belong? Who decides what respect looks like? And what happens when a man who has been told his whole life that he doesn't belong finally refuses to stay silent? The CEO sat in his cell, his body tired, his spirit torn. His lawyers prepared for the battle ahead, but he knew the outcome would not change what he had done. He could not undo the blood, the scream, the crack of glass. He could not restore the billion-dollar deal, nor could he give his mother the peace she had deserved that night. All he could do was sit with the weight of it, a weight heavier than any prison walls could hold. The courtroom was never meant to hold a story this heavy. Faces lined the benches, some curious, others angry, but most simply seeked Einid. For weeks the trial had been the center of attention, filling headlines and dominating conversations in every circle, from boardrooms to neighborhood barbershops. The story wasn't just about a cancelled deal anymore. It was about power, dignity, and the wounds left behind when wealth is used as a weapon. The billionaire family, who had mocked a woman for her background, sat at the defense table, their usual arrogance dulled by the constant flash of cameras and the whispers that followed them everywhere. Their empire had taken a blow the day the black CEO walked away from the $900 million deal, and now the court was shining a light on the deeper rot that had been ignored for too long. Lawsuits piled up. Partners distanced themselves. Their family name, once associated with influence and respect, had become shorthand for cruelty and arrogance. On the other side sat the CEO and his mother. She looked smaller than she once had, her posture bent with age and the weight of humiliation she never asked for. But there was a quiet strength in the way she held her son's hand. For her, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about money. It was about being seen, being treated as human, in a world that had so often treated her as invisible. The legal outcome was clear enough. The billionaire family faced a slew of civil penalties and financial settlements. Their public image was in ruins, and though they weren't locked behind prison bars, they were trapped in a cage of disgrace that no wealth could buy them out of. Justice, at least in the legal sense, was served. Yet it didn't feel like a victory. Too much damage had been done. For the CEO, the choice to cancel the deal was a turning point. Some saw it as reckless, throwing away almost $1 billion over personal pride. But those who looked deeper saw it for what it was: a man refusing to let his success be built on the back of disrespect to the very person who raised him. He carried the burden of that choice heavily. Investors questioned his judgment, competitors saw an opening, and not every board member agreed with the stand he had taken. But in his heart, he knew it was the only decision that allowed him to live with himself. The community saw him differently now. Some admired his courage. Others whispered that pride had cost him too much. But for young black entrepreneurs, for single mothers raising sons in neighborhoods where no one expected greatness, his stand became a story worth repeating, a reminder that dignity was worth more than a dollar figure, no matter how high. The mother, though quiet throughout it all, became a symbol in her own way. She hadn't asked to be thrust into the spotlight, but her humiliation and the way she carried herself afterward revealed something larger than just a cruel moment at a dinner table. It showed how easily respect could be stripped away by those with power, and how resilience could turn even the deepest wound into a form of resistance. As the dust settled, society was left to wrestle with the uncomfortable truths this case brought into the open. It wasn't just about racism or arrogance, though both played their part. It was about the culture of wealth that allowed cruelty to be excused in the name of business. It was about the fragile line between personal dignity and professional ambition. It was about the question that lingered in every conversation: what do we truly value more? Success at any cost, or respect that cannot be bought? In boardrooms, conversations shifted. Companies began training executives in cultural sensitivity, not because it was the right thing to do, but because the public backlash had proven how costly humiliation could be. The media played its part, dissecting every detail, holding up the story as both a cautionary tale and a morality play. Yet underneath the noise, what lingered was simpler, more human. A son had chosen his mother's dignity over his own fortune. For the billionaire family, the fall from grace was permanent. Their wealth ensured they would never struggle for food or shelter, but they could no longer buy respect. Invitations dried up, endorsements disappeared, and every appearance was met with whispers and side glances. They had become living reminders of how quickly cruelty turns into isolation when the world decides to stop looking away. For the CEO, life carried on, though never quite the same. Deals were harder to close, not because he lacked skill, but because trust is slow to rebuild in an industry obsessed with numbers. Yet he gained something intangible, a kind of moral authority that couldn't be written into contracts or measured in stock prices. He walked taller, even as the weight of loss pressed on him, because he knew he hadn't betrayed the person who gave him everything. And for his mother, there was peace. The scars remained, but she no longer lived in silence. Strangers reached out with letters, with words of kindness, telling her that her story had moved them, that her quiet strength had reminded them of their own mothers, their own battles against invisibility. She didn't need the world to see her as a symbol, but for the first time, she felt that her life, the sacrifices, the struggles, the love, had been honored in a way that money could never measure. The story closed not with victory, but with reflection. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but the deeper justice lay in the reminder it left behind. That power without compassion is fragile. That dignity, once lost, leaves wounds deeper than wealth can heal. And that the choices we make in moments of crisis define not just our futures, but the kind of people we decide to be. In the end, it wasn't about a cancelled deal or a ruined empire. It was about the unspoken truth that wealth may build empires, but respect, or the lack of it, can bring them crashing down. And in that truth, a mother and her son found something far greater than any business agreement. They found a measure of freedom in standing tall against humiliation, no matter the cost. You do not have enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan.